All right, welcome everybody to WZ's All Access event. Thanks for joining us today. I am honored and humbled and excited to have a guest with us today, Mark Fallon, who's down in much warmer weather than I am. How are you doing today, Mark?
I'm doing wonderful. Thanks, Dave.
Let me give a little bit of background here to Mark, which is it's tough to say a little bit of background when talking about somebody like Mark with his experience and just I'm excited and again thankful for Mark to volunteer some of his time today to not just talk to me but to talk to all of you that are listening, all the investigators out there, those of you that are in charge of training programs, that are practitioners, that are academics, that are advocates for kind of the world of investigative interviewing or interviews or interrogations as a whole. If you look at what's up on the screen, I tried to take a snippet of Mark's extensive background, and we'll get into some of this as we discuss these principles today. But as you can see, kind of two of the main things I want to focus on for Mark's background is he was on, I believe, a 15-person steering committee, which helped develop the Mendez Principles, which is what we're really going to talk about today. But also, definitely of worthy note, Mark's co-founder of Project Alethea out of John Jay College, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. I know you've done some work with Maria Hartwig over there, and you guys are doing amazing things with academic practitioner partnership. But the rest of this list is definitely not all inclusive. So thanks for your service to the United States over 30 years in federal government work. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Have you officially removed that from your brain yet?
Yeah, I've served my sentence.
Yeah. Yeah. I was talking to Mark a little bit. It seems like he mentioned to me anytime there was terrorism involved, sometimes there's Mark Fallon in the background, but I think it's from a positive standpoint, from an investigative, I hope. But Mark's done some really incredible work with NCIS. As you guys can see, Deputy Assistant Director for Counterterrorism, he served. He was went from kind of an investigative standpoint, which we'll talk about a little bit, investigated the terrorist attack on USS Cole, and then also served in a training capacity as Assistant Director for Training at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, FLETC. Also serves as Chair of the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the Impact Section, past Chair of the HIG, High Value Detainee Interrogation Group. So just a ton of experience. And every time I talk to Mark, I learn a lot, and I'm kind of challenged in my thought process. And I asked Mark, and he was more than willing, and always is, to volunteer his experience and his kind of knowledge to share with all of you on where the world of interviewing is and where it's going, and maybe where it should be. So again, thanks, Mark, for joining us. What did I miss here in your background that sticks out to you as the one thing that people know Mark Fallon most by, besides you being a Bills fan, which I've heard earlier today?
Yeah. I think you covered all I want to give up right now.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. What I wanted to kind of kick off with is I've talked, and our company at WZ has talked a lot about these principles of effective interviewing and the Mendez Principles, but maybe give us just kind of some baseline. First of all, why Mendez, right? The name Juan Mendez, I know, is kind of a trigger of why it's kind of nicknamed that, but what was the genesis of these principles? Where did it come from? And what is kind of the role of how these stand in a global picture?
Yeah, thanks, David. Thanks for the warm introduction, and really honored to be here with you and your audience today. Juan Mendez was someone, shamefully, a name that I did not know in 2016. I did not know who Juan Mendez was at that time. I got a phone call from Andra Nicolosu, who was a program manager working with Juan at the Anti-Torture Initiative at the Washington College of Law at Merkin University, and said, Juan Mendez, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, and he would like to know if you would be a special advisor to him as he's drafting a thematic to present to the United Nations at the General Assembly at the end of his 6-year term. And I thought, this is outstanding. Do I bill hourly or do you want a daily rate? And they said, oh no, this is all pro bono. And I looked at Juan's background and found out he was an attorney in Argentina who was defending clients who were victims of human rights abuses, was arrested by the Argentinian authorities, and himself was the victim of torture before he became the UN Special Rapporteur, and a professor at Washington College of Law at Merkin University. And when I looked into his background, I said I'd be honored to do what I can to contribute. And Juan brought together a number of people from around the world to the Washington College of Law, and we sat around for a few days and we helped Juan draft his thematic that he presented, this report to the United Nations, which basically said that there needs to be a universal standard around the world about how we interview people. And this is really based on what's happened is really due to the torture programs within the United States. This is what really the catalyst for all this family of interrogational abuses that were applied post 9/11 is what triggered the things that subsequently happened and the level of emphasis that was placed on it. And one of the things, my input to that process at the time, Dave, was, and it was, I think, very impactful on Juan. I said that, at the time in 2010, I became the name to the High Value Detainee Interrogation Group Research Committee. And the HIG, the High Value Detainee Interrogation Group, was a multi-service agency or unit that was formed that had a director from the FBI, a deputy director from the CIA, and a deputy director from the Department of Defense. And the HIG was created in 2010 after President Obama took office in 2009 and issued an executive order called 13491, which said, we will not torture, but we need to determine what the most effective methods are to obtain information and protect our national security. And to do that, we need science. And as I said, there's an NPR journalist called me the Forrest Gump of terrorism, right? So I seem to be in the background of all of these things. One of the things that impacted the Obama administration was something that occurred during the President George W. Bush administration. As you know, I was the chief investigator for Al-Qaeda for military commissions, and we were getting a lot of bad information. We were getting bad information from the CIA, just horrible information. Threat levels were going up. Resources were being flooded to areas that based on fabricated data that was coming out of prisoners based on coercion. The Office of Director of National Intelligence under President Bush commissioned a report. It was published in, I think, 2006 called Educing Information. And the two of the people that were the authors of that, the editors, Dr. Robert Fine and Brian Voskul, were on my behavioral science consulting team when I was the special agent in charge of the Criminal Investigation Task Force. And so these people who previously had been with the Secret Service and helped create the National Threat Center for the Secret Service were on my behavioral science consulting team trying to help give me advice on what to do with prisoners at Guantanamo and elsewhere. And we were looking at what the potential threat level might be, the risk level might be, should they be released or transferred. And so when they commissioned this Educing Information report, they came up with some startling information to me. What they discovered and what this report said was that it had been more than 50 years since the US government had really dedicated into substantial research into why someone would talk to somebody like me or you. We had done a lot of on the job training. We had done a lot of do as I do. I did it this way, you do it this way, right? Customary learning. This was effective for me. Let me tell you how to do it, kids, so it'll be effective for you. But it was not based on science. So move forward now to 2016 with Juan Mendez. And based on my role as the chair of the HIG Research Committee, where I was seeing, we had over 100 evidence-based research projects that I helped contribute to, that I reviewed. I work with research scientists. I worked helping train investigators, interrogators at the HIG. I was a consultant to the HIG as well as the research committee. So what I told Juan was, had I had the portfolio of research that is available today back in 2002, I may have been more persuasive in convincing the authorities I reported to the Secretary of Defense not to go down this road of this family of interrogational abuses. And so, that was really something that stuck with Juan and the others there, that uninformed decisions were made based on the lack of science. And so I felt it was critical, and Juan felt it was critical, that in his thematic, what he said is that, and we'll get to this when we get to the Mendez Principles, that it is based on law, ethics, and science. Because what this body of emerging science has revealed is that not only are these information gathering techniques, which we'll talk about, and really this mind shift, the mindset away from this confession-driven processes to an information gathering methods, is the science makes a difference. And the fact is that the human rights compliant methods are the most effective ones. And so what we found, and the reason that President Obama created the Hague under his administration, at least, was the acknowledgement that science can inform the practice, and the practice can inform the policymakers, because some very detrimental policy decisions were made by policymakers based on inaccurate, unreliable, and oftentimes fabricated information. And so for informed decisions, you need science to help you make those decisions.
I think there's a lot there to unpack, which is really helpful for the group that we have here. I know I saw Professor Hartwig has joined us and is watching and commented. So for those of you who want to learn more about the project that her and Mark have worked on, she put a link in the chat. So thanks Maria for hopping on. And for anybody that's listening, by the way, the reason we're doing this in kind of a live format is if you have questions for Mark or I, feel free to put them into the chat, and I'll make sure that Mark can see those so we can address as we go through. I also know, you mentioned some of the administrative decisions and the science and maybe the fabricated information that was presented. So I don't want to steal away from this, but I do know you have a book behind you, Unjustifiable Means, that I think was the first way we connected. I read that a couple of years ago now and reached out to you. And I know IAI, so the International Association of Interviewers, for those of you that are members or aware of the association, Mark is doing a kind of a book club conversation about that into the spring of next year. So a lot of really good content around what that whole process looked like, of the science that came forward to maybe justify, we can say, what we decided to do as a government several years ago. But to move past that into what I want to talk about with the principles, for those people that are listening, I know we've got folks in the private sector, so that might be loss prevention, security, human resources, investigators. We've got law enforcement. We might have detectives. We have patrol officers. We could have command staff. We may have some federal law enforcement, federal agencies, that listen and kind of want to take away from this. And so what we're going to do here is let me just show real quick what these principles are. I know we keep talking about them, so let me show you what they are. What you have up on the screen now is a bit of an eye chart, but it's all 6 principles. We're going to break down really each of these and just spend a couple minutes on each one, and how we can translate what these principles are into your everyday life as an investigator, as a trainer, as an advocate, as somebody who's interested in doing things the right way. Mark, what I liked, I'm curious, as you guys develop this from a user standpoint, you talked about maybe science was either inaccessible or didn't exist from a practitioner standpoint. I could tell you, I'm still not great at it, but rewind before I went back to school, I don't even think I could read a research study and understood what in the world these different parts were. What is a research method? I didn't know. And most investigators aren't privy to that. And what I liked about the way these principles are written, and you guys can see the source on the bottom here, there's a website you can look at all of these kind of open source for you, but really simplified into these 6 concepts. And it's a really easy kind of end user takeaway of what each of these are. And you already referenced this first one, so let's get into that. Principle 1 is on the foundation of effective interviewing is instructed by science, law, and ethics. You just mentioned this. I think law and ethics make sense to all investigators, right? We want to do stuff that's legal for obvious reasons, also making sure that any information is admissible. Obviously, ethical should be obvious, but the science piece, I'm curious from you, if similar to me as a practitioner, how did you feel about trying to incorporate research and science and all this academic stuff that might have been foreign to you at one point? How's that impacted kind of your perspective on this whole process?
Yeah, it's really changed my life, frankly. But Dave, before I get to that, let me just, if you don't mind, I'll just give a little bit of background on these principles, because
Yeah.
these did not develop overnight. So that thematic was 2016. In 2017, I was asked to speak at a sidebar at the United Nations General Assembly in the Great Hall. A rather humbling experience myself in there. Before the Secretary General for Human Rights, the Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights was the moderator of a panel I was on. And I said the same thing. I urged the United Nations members to really endorse this change in mindset to embrace the research. And from that meeting, when Nils Meltzer replaced Juan Mendez as the special rapporteur, he decided to endorse that process, and we went forward with it. And three entities were formed as a coordinated group: the Norwegian Center for Human Rights, the Anti-Torture Initiative at Washington College of Law at American University, and the Association for the Prevention of Torture in Geneva, Switzerland, were a coordinating group that brought together these 15 steering committee members that I was one of, this global steering committee of experts that they brought together from different countries and from different backgrounds: lawyers, psychiatrists, ethicists, and practitioners like myself. But that group, that steering committee, was assisted by an advisory council of over 80 people from 40 countries. And so you talk about those six principles. It didn't start as six. And it started, I think, as over 200-page document that we got down to a distillable version. But that was a 4-year process to publish those Mendez Principles. We went to different countries. We talked to different leaders in countries. We talked about problems going on. And we went to Brazil, went to Tunisia. We went to Thailand. This was a 4-year journey for me that I'm very proud of, that we were able to come up with these principles that are now being endorsed. So I just wanted to give that a background. This wasn't something that people winged. This was an arduous, sometimes painful process to come up with what we came up with. And that's one of the reasons you mentioned that it's good for loss prevention people and things. It is intentionally called effective interviewing. It's not called investigative interviewing. It's not called intelligence interviewing. It's not called interrogation. These are communication skills. What the principles set the framework for is a design and development of processes that will elicit accurate, reliable information from human beings that still preserve human rights. But back to your principle one of the things that we wanted to make sure it preserves is human dignity. The dignity not only of the person interrogated, but the interrogator. And I know in the UK and some places you can't say interrogation. It has a pejorative context, but to me it's a benign term. There's legal ramifications where you interview witnesses, you interrogate suspects, and so I don't shy away from the word interrogation or interrogator. Some do, but I consider it just a benign term. Actually, the Webster's Dictionary has a sample that says she skillfully interrogated the witness. It's an interrogatory. It's a question format. So I just want to get that out of the way, because some people are still they get very nervous when they hear that term. I do not. But we really looked at some friends of mine. A guy named Eric Fair wrote a book called Consequence. He was an interrogator at Abu Ghraib who tortured people, and Consequence is about his struggle today for what he did. And so one of the things we wanted to make sure that we did was that we preserve dignity, because post 9/11, uh, individuals were asked to do things by their country that they are still paying for emotionally today, right? This family of interrogational abuses. So one of the things we want to make sure about the foundations, that it's ethical, because as leaders, we should not be asking the people that look to us to lead them to do things that they may regret later on. And that's when I was the special agent in charge of the criminal investigation task force. That's one of the things that we instilled in our people, is that when this war is over, the war on terrorism, as we called it at the time, your grandchildren are going to ask what you did during the war. And what we want you to be able to do is say that you served with honor and you served with dignity. And so that's one of the things that the Mendez Principles does, is ensure that we preserve the dignity of both the interrogatee and the interrogator.
Yeah, I think that's a really unique perspective, right? We're thinking ethical, obviously, and from a legal standpoint of how we conduct it to get information. But I think sometimes people forget what the potential trauma or mental capacity of the interviewer themselves and the lasting effect, that could have on all ranges, right? We talk to a lot of people in our classes that are even, interviewing an employee that sometimes live with that afterwards of what was the impact, not only to the employee, but also to themselves of, the impact they had on that person's life or their career. So I think that's really interesting. The you mentioned evidence-based a few times in the kind of introduction of research into practice. And then you said how practice also informs policy. And I think that's important. A lot of what I know WZ has been working on the last few years is really embracing and introducing research into our classes, and also allowing it to maybe adjust how we practice these skills, but then also kind of pushing back the other way. And as practitioner, and just as you, I think it's neat when you said you had, over 80 people and you visit all these countries, is you're looking at perspectives from, I'm sure, people of all ages, cultures, different stereotypes, different perspectives of a criminal legal system. I can imagine those were some healthy debates to get to kind of narrow down on these 6 principles, which it ties into the second principle, which is some of the pushback that I know I've seen out there when you go out and try to conduct training programs that are new or different and incorporate research, is investigators want to know and should know, well, does it work? Right? Does it still get us what we need it to get? And the answer is yes, but it's a little bit more in depth than that. So on principle number 2 is this concept of on practice. And so you can explain better what this means, but I did underline one concept of this that I want to expand on, where it talks about it's a comprehensive process for gathering accurate and reliable information while implementing associated legal safeguards. What it doesn't say here, which I think is really important note, it doesn't say effective interviewing gets you more confessions. So if you can kind of expand on that, what is the goal of an interview, and how when people ask, well, does it work? If you have to incorporate research, how do you respond to some of those challenges?
Yeah, the best method of detecting deception is a known or checkable fact. Right. So if I know a fact and question you about it, I'm going to know. And that's why I always say I was an investigator who did interrogations rather than an interrogator. I may have done interrogations as part of my investigative process, but my title was criminal investigator. I was a special agent. That's what I was. And so the goal is to gather accurate, reliable information. If you focus on a confession, you may get a confession. And what we find is that in some of the types of approaches that you guys have moved away from, right, that you used to teach years ago, with these theme-based methodologies, what we found, what the research showed, was that they are a very effective means of getting a confession from a guilty suspect, as well as an innocent suspect.
Right.
And so, what good is that? What we found is that the information gathering methods, these science-based methods, get you more truthful information, less false information, and more overall information. If your goal is a confession, you're going to stop when you get the confession. You don't know what you've left on the table. You don't know what cards have yet to be turned over. The goal is to collect the information, analyze it, and then determine if that information may be evidentiary, it might be inculpatory, it might be exculpatory, it may be intelligence. It may help form knowledge of another case. It may help develop other witnesses. So that's why the goal is information gathering, and not just information, accurate, reliable information, so that you can make an informed decision about which direction your case might go, about what you might decide about that person that you're talking to, what information. We all report to somebody. If you're a loss prevention specialist, you may report to your manager. What are you going to tell that manager about that interview? You want the best data, the best information. And so that's, you'll see that throughout, is about accurate, reliable information, not confession driven. We really need to steer away from that, because that narrows the focus and really gets tunnel vision by the investigators, and it's to the detriment of their cases.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. The tunnel vision piece on two spots. I see what you just said happen often, right? Somebody gets the confession, I did it, and it's all right. Let me write up my report. Case closed. We're not substantiating the investigation thoroughly. We're not looking for additional intelligence. And then the other thing that I think happens as an interviewer is if I'm solely focused on a confession, first of all, that means I walked in that interview with a presumption of guilt.
Right.
Which we know is going to cause me to probably be a little bit more coercive or desperate in that interview, which is going to be improper. Secondly, if I'm solely focused on the confession and I'm not getting a confession, I'm going to get frustrated. And when I get frustrated, is going to disrupt the entire process, and it's going to be communicated to the interviewee as well. So I think that's important. One of the, and I'm curious your thoughts on this, but one of the, from a policy standpoint, reforms we're seeing throughout, at least the United States, is mandated recording, electronic recording of interviews, which I think helps investigators, that if I'm not just going for a confession and I can strategically use evidence, if at least I have the entire interview recorded, that strengthens kind of the power of that conversation and the transparency of it, versus I needed to get I did it, I read up my report and it's done. So any thoughts on that and the power?
Yeah, Dave, it would be like at the end of this conversation, if this wasn't recorded and I asked you to write up everything we said,
right?
How accurate would you be able to do that?
Yeah.
It's difficult. You're under cognitive load now because you're talking to me, right? You're
Right.
listening to my answers. You're trying to formulate the next question. This is an effective interview process, right? And so I'm very proud that NCIS, my former organization, was the first federal agency to mandate video recordings in their interrogations. They did it because juries weren't believing our processes. They weren't believing our rapport base because of, the CSI effect, or maybe what they saw on TV. You hear a lot about that.
Right.
So I think that video recording interviews are essential because one, there's diagnostic purposes. Two, you cannot remember everything that's said in there. I know during the cold investigation, we had people on the ground in Yemen that were interrogating suspects and giving me information back at the running the task force in Washington. And I'm having to talk every morning to the director of NCIS and the director of naval intelligence about threat warnings that are going on, so they know what ships can go into what harbors, or where they can sail, or whether Marines should deploy somewhere. And I'm having to rely on the special agents from NCIS and the FBI's recollection of what was said during key aspects of those interviews. Now, just think of the value of that recording.
Right.
It could be analyzed by analysts. It could be looked at a second time, a third time, a fourth time. It can be preserved. That's why these recordings are so essential. We're going to miss things. When you look at this recording and I look at it, I'm probably going to hear myself say things that I forgot I said,
Right.
that I don't realize that I talked about during this conversation. So yeah, I highly recommend and endorse those policies that mandate recorded interviews.
Yeah, I think it's important, and I know a lot in the private sector kind of deal with some opposition to that from a cost standpoint, from a liability standpoint, and these kind of things. But at a minimum, if we're not even recording yet, of having somebody in that room or listening to that conversation that can focus on taking notes and memorializing some of that conversation for afterwards, I think is important.
And David, can I say something else? I hate to interrupt you, but I want to talk about an interview being effective. because I faced this, with Guantanamo. We had almost 800 people, 780 people, whatever the number is that we had there cycling through there during the early years. And we would have to do interviews and interrogations and do assessments of them. And I go back to the Pentagon and they say, oh, your interviews aren't effective because they aren't determining they're terrorists. Yes, they are effective because they're determining they're not.
Right.
We are determining the truth. The accurate, reliable information, as a majority of the people should not have ever been there in the first place. So a successful interview isn't the confession. The successful interview is obtaining the truth, the accurate and reliable information about that person, which may help exonerate them. And frankly, I had more investigators working to exonerate people and get them released from Guantanamo than I did working cases that we were looking to prosecute for military commission. That's a successful investigation. And those are very successful interrogations because they determine innocence as well as guilt.
That's a great point. And I think that hopefully those that are listening, there's a direct shot as well to leadership, to supervisors, to command staff, is because I know on both sides what that's like after an interview. When you're calling the boss or the supervisor and they want to know how it went. And if you're leading a team and your direction is, well, if they didn't get a confession, if they didn't get the I did it, that was a failure, then you're losing the direction of this whole process, right? You're part of the problem. So I think that's a really good point. A lot of these cases I've seen now from a false confession, wrongful conviction standpoint is investigators had enough information in their hands to have cleared somebody originally, but instead used some of these coercive techniques to get information that wasn't true and led them down the wrong path, which is a whole nother conversation we can tie into, which also goes to the principle number 3 as we talk about vulnerability. Something that I've been passionate about and kind of my focus into the world of false confessions started for me learning about Brendan Dassey's case from Netflix's Making a Murderer, but people don't realize it's not just a series on Netflix. It's a real person and real people that are impacted by this. But from Brendan's standpoint, when we talk about vulnerability, is we had his age, we had some cognitive impairments among some other things. But when we think about vulnerability from your experience, we've got everything from what was known as learned helplessness to people exhaustion, to hunger, to age, to mental impairment. So what are some of your thoughts and kind of the basis of principle number 3 on vulnerability?
Yeah, I mean, it really goes into the power dynamic, the power of the state working against the individual. And you see people, and oftentimes when you look at these cases, and you've looked at them, Dave, you see people are sleep deprived, they're hungry, they're under tremendous pressure and stress. Some of them may have low IQs and other things, but they're in situations where they're highly vulnerable and susceptible to pressure. And sometimes those pressures lead them to confess to crimes they didn't commit. And I wrote a piece in Police Chief Magazine, I think last year, called Untruths and Consequences, talking about how I was trained that an innocent person wouldn't confess to a crime they didn't commit. And I have said that in the past, and I have said that to people who I have trained because I was ignorant of that, right? I was ignorant of the fact that people do confess to crimes that they commit. And so this is really where we need to change. And this is where science comes in. The science of DNA has shown us conclusively that people have been wrongfully convicted of crimes they didn't commit. And depending on what time you look at the figures, 1/3 to 1/4 of those people have falsely confessed to crimes they didn't commit. And so this is really why we have to get away from this confession-driven model. We need to understand these people are vulnerable. We need to understand the dynamics of these false confessions that would occur, because it's horrendous enough that we're putting someone in jail for a crime they didn't commit, but we're also leaving the perpetrator on the street.
Right.
Right. So the person who actually committed those crimes is getting away with it and is able out there to victimize more people in our society. And so that's why I'm so passionate about this stuff, is that, twofold. One, it's horrendous, and we should never be doing anything that would bring an innocent person to be incarcerated, but also think about the guilty person is still on the street.
Yeah, I agree. And a couple of takeaways here for those that are listening. One, we had a comment came in from Lori, which is great. She's talking about this kind of focus on getting away from just confession seeking to our last point. Is very parallel to trauma-informed interviews and investigations. I know it's something that we've been starting to offer some classes on, and yeah, I think that's a good takeaway. Is we're not just trying to get the "I did it" or "here's exactly what happened." It's allowing somebody else to kind of tell their story without contamination, which is helpful. But this concept of vulnerabilities that we were just talking about is making sure if I'm in charge of a company, of an agency, of whatever, of a task force, do we have either training and or policies or guidelines if we're going to talk to somebody who has some type of vulnerability? And I've seen agencies looking at different companies kind of SOP, and if we have somebody who's a juvenile, which they might define by a certain age, typically under 18, but what we've seen the research show is cognitively development's happening at around full development at 25 years old. And so it's just being aware as an investigator that if I'm going to talk to somebody who's maybe 16 years old, their incentive or their focus is, how do I get out of the room as quickly as possible and back to normal life, back to safety? And the easiest way to get out of the room is just tell somebody what they want to hear. But that same thing can apply to I haven't had a break in a long time, or I haven't eaten in 6 hours, or I got to go pick up my kids. How do I get out of this interview or interrogation? And so I think understanding that and having policies in place is what these principles are guiding agencies, government institutions, and companies to do. Is what are you doing about it? We can talk about it, but what are you going to implement differently?
Dave, and unfortunately, someone who's vulnerable in these situations is someone who's innocent. Because if you have someone who believes they are guilty and focuses on that confession, it wears those people down sometimes, and they wind up confessing because they think that they're eventually going to be cleared.
Right.
They know they didn't do it, but no one ever believes them when they recant, because they've confessed now, and everyone goes forward with that. And so really the innocent people are vulnerable to these confession-driven tactics.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. That's a point. As we got a couple more of these to go through, and the next one is about training. But one of the specific tactics that, at the point you just made, Mark, is in line with is the false evidence ploy. Is investigators that lie about evidence. If I, for example, for those that are watching, if I tell Mark that we have his fingerprints, or we have video surveillance, or whatever it might be, and we actually don't, or we have DNA and we actually don't, an innocent person is assuming that you're going to go actually use that evidence to clear them, which means if I confess, there's no problem here, because I can say I did it, I get out of the room, you go check the video, check the DNA, it wasn't me, all is good, only to find out that you don't have any of that evidence. So my confession is what it is, and I never leave that room at all, other than in handcuffs. And so when we talk about principle 4 about training, that's not something I was aware of, right? I've used that tactic before. I'm sure you have as well. It's the way we were trained. I didn't know the impact of some of these tactics or techniques until I was trained on the research and what it shows, and just from a practical standpoint, that there's better ways to get information. So for principle 4, what does that mean? And somebody in your position who went from very heavily practitioner based, conducting interviews, interrogations, to then somebody who said, I'm going to try to change the world by training, and assistant director at FLETC doing training. And what does that look like when we say on principle 4, a professional undertaking that requires specific training? What does that mean?
Yeah, Dave, frankly, I've been enlightened. I've seen the light. I've been informed. My knowledge has grown. I now have wisdom. I'm not sure what year. I think it may have been 2014. I was speaking at the ILETA conference, International Law Enforcement Educators and Trainers Association conference in Wheeling, Illinois, doing a presentation on behalf of the HIG with Maria Hartwig and Chris Meisner, another brilliant research scientist out of Iowa State University. And Maria, she was notified while we were there in Illinois that she was selected for sabbatical at Yale. And I said, Maria, I don't understand this sabbatical thing. I hear it, but what does that mean? She said, well, it's something that in academics, it gives us a chance to think. And so I flippantly, as I usually do, said, I thought you had to do that during your job. But and then I commented that the U.S. government gave me a sabbatical time to think. They called it retirement. And so, since I've retired, at least from active federal service in 2010, with my appointment to the High-Bay Detainee Interrogation Group Research Committee, I've been enlightened. And I've seen the error of my past ways, what this new knowledge of the research has affirmed with me was why some of the methods I was using and employing were effective, why they were working. I understand there's some scientific validity to why some of those approaches may have been effective. Also, I learned that some of the things that I thought were effective were not as effective as I may have thought they were. And I learned there were things that I ought never to do again. And so principle 4 on training is about interviewing being a professional undertaking that requires special training, right? So as an NCIS special agent, I started as a deputy U.S. Marshal before that. And I worked patrol for a little while in Oline, Connecticut, right? And you go to the range quarterly and you qualify with your weapon to show you're proficient. And we do tactical training and drills and things like that for the eventuality of some tactical response we may have to do. And we're tested on a lot of things. But when are we ever trained on interviewing? When are we ever tested on our interviewing skills? When does a supervisor have the time to look at those tapes to see about the methods that you're utilizing in your interviewing practices? So I really think we need to take this and look at this as, and I call myself an interrogation professional. And I don't think there's a lot of interrogation professionals out there. There are some people who are interrogators, but there's not a lot of people who have embraced the science and who understand how to effectively apply that science. And that gets to, with the establishment of Project Aletheia, that was created and established based on frustration that I had with the fact that there are two different silos, and that Maria Hartway had with her silos. You had these academics, these scholars in this silo looking at the research, and you have practitioners in this silo practicing. And sometimes they may cross paths, but they're not intertwined. There are not a lot of, now some of them have, there are not a lot of researchers who actually bring the practitioners into the design and development of their research processes. There are more and more now. I'm called in, I'm doing research, I'm helping guide them, I'm doing that. And that is because of the Hague and some of the researchers that have embraced me. And so when I was and I'm the past chair now, I served 8 years as the vice chair and chair of the impact section of the ICP. My frustrations with impact, whose charter was to spread research, was that it cost money for researchers to join the ICP. Right. And then it cost money for them to join the impact section. And then if you wanted to come to the ICP conference to show your research, you had to get your research selected. But now you had to pay to come to the conference and be at the conference. And it was a very expensive proposition. And so in that time, while I got people like Maria to join impact and be a member of the section and contribute and help work on some subcommittees I established. But the same thing with practitioners. It costs money to look at research. There's paywalls. And so we formed Project Aletheia as this entity that's free to join, so that practitioners like yourself and me, I don't understand those research reports either, Dave. I need to get a scholar to help walk me through to understand, are these valid methodologies here? Am I missing something here? And so that's what we did with Project Aletheia, is try to connect with some of these top leading, globally renowned experts in the interrogation scientists with practitioners who are interested in really embracing the research. And so it's really just this kind of network we've established with the aim of, we call it bridging the gap between the science and practice of interrogation. But it's really so that we kind of integrate these silos together in a unified approach. And hopefully we'll have more practitioners who really understand the science. And if I could, I'm going to just read, if you don't mind,
Yeah.
just the 2 paragraphs out of Principle 4 on training, because I think this is really the essence of the Mendez Principles. Specific training will ensure a high degree of consistency how interviewers prepare and structure the interview. It's a continuum, right? It doesn't start in the box. It's this continuous process. The training should teach practical methodologies drawing upon relevant research that shows that certain interview techniques facilitate the retrieval of accurate, reliable accounts and minimize the risk of obtaining false information. This is getting away from that confession driven because it's getting false data, right? The content of the training in effective interviewing, again, effective interviewing, intentional terminology, should include the establishing the importance of the interview as a critical part of a wider investigative or information gathering process, and ultimately the process of justice, right? And so we're doing that interview, that interrogation, your loss prevention manager, whatever it is part of this larger process or system. For me as a federal agent, part of a broader justice system, right? And so we are a cog in that system. But if that information is corrupted, it taints the rest of that process. And so that's really the emphasis on this accurate, reliable information. And it then goes on to say that regardless of jurisdictions, we need to emphasize the effectiveness of interviewing. And that's a science, because again, the tolerance for abuses come from ineffective or inept practice. And you see there's defunding the police movement going on, and people are losing trust in the police, right? There's mistrust now between the communities the police serve and the police. And this is, you get back to what you said, Dave, about this false evidence ploy. I think that we need to start policing with virtue.
Right.
I don't think police should lie during the interview. We should be above that. We should be relying on skill. We should be relying on strategy. We should be relying on wit. We shouldn't be relying on luck, trickery, deceit, deceptive practice. We should police with virtue. And to me, that's what I'm talking about, professional undertaking. We need people to accept that interviewing, there's a science behind it. And just because you did it that way doesn't mean you ought to keep doing it that way.
Yeah, that was a great, I hope everybody, if you didn't listen to anything else, the last 3 minutes were a perfect takeaway from really everything these principles stand for. Because if you don't have the infrastructure of a training system in place, and you're not holding people accountable to that system, right, it's hard to expect the singular interviewer somewhere on that totem pole of command to be doing it the right way, which goes into principle 5, which I'll talk about in a second, accountability. But I think what you mentioned about first about the project that you and Maria are working on, which is really an incredible concept of this academic practitioner integration. We've seen a lot of that, a lot of success at WZ. And what's interesting is, as a practitioner, you kind of are hesitant or maybe fearful to enter the academic world. And what I didn't recognize is a lot of people in the academic world that might have had the same perception of practitioners. And I've had some really great interactions with people like, Saul Casson has been a great mentor over there at John Jay. And a shout out to Professor Haley Cleary, a developmental psychologist, who actually spent some time with the WZ instructor staff discussing her research and how that might apply to interviewing, but then in turn allowing our investigators to then speak to her about what is it like in the actual interview room. And so that cross kind of pollination of conversations have really at least helped us kind of formulate our content and understand the right way to go about it. So I think that's important, and then integrate that into the training the professional training. The second piece of what you mentioned that I took away, if you're relying on the way you've always done it, kind of like you mentioned, without being informed or enlightened, then that also means if you don't have a training program in place, you're relying on your 20 to 30 year veteran to train the next person who trains the next person who trains the next person. And these kind of train the trainer on the job approach often just perpetuates bad habits. And a lot of times we're so results based that, well, I got a confession, so what I did must have been right. It's kind of like if I won a hand of poker, the way I played it must have been right, but maybe I just got really, really lucky. Yep. And now I'm just going to continue to play bad and hoping I'm get lucky again. So having a structured training is important. And then the last piece of that, and it goes into the last 2 principles, actually, I think about interviewing as a profession, it's kind of like if I was going to go have an operation done, right? Go have surgery, go a medical professional. I'm hoping that, yes, they graduated from med school 30 years ago, but boy, do I hope they've read some kind of research in the last 3 decades, because there's been some new stuff that's come out that might be helpful to me, versus just, this is the way I did it in 1985, so I'm going to continue to do it this way. And understanding that interviewing is a profession, is a professional skill set, and is something that needs to incorporate continued education, I think is really important. So those points were really, really good that you made there. The last two principles, we've kind of hit on these in different concepts, but principle 5 of accountability, we talked a little bit about this with recording, but anything else you want to talk about here, this concept of being transparent and accountable? What does that mean for those people that are in charge of kind of creating an interview program?
Yeah, it really needs to be a shift in mindset. It needs to be both driven top down and bottoms up, right? And again, I'll use NCIS as an example because I came from that organization, so I know a little bit about what still goes on in that organization. And so, just within the last year, the director of NCIS went out with call it a general administration, a communique to the field, and basically said, "It doesn't matter how you've been trained before. It doesn't matter how you've been practiced." And I'm paraphrasing a little bit. How you've practiced your interviewing skills before. From this day forward, we will only use science-based methods in our own interviewing practices. They sent teams to the NCS Training Academy of FLETC, and FLETC has since evolved their training to only science-based methods. But the director also, went out to the field and had training for supervisors, because you have to ensure that, and this was my challenge when I was the director of the NCS Training Academy, was that we were training new skills and competencies far beyond those that their supervisors might have. Mm. And so you have to ensure that when they get to the field, their supervisors don't then countermand all the training that you've done. So this accountability piece needs to be institutional. And that's what I was very happy to see, at least with NCIS, when it came to the science-based interview methods.
Yeah, I've seen that. The last piece you just mentioned is probably more common than people want to realize, especially as supervisors or command staff. So we think, all right, I'm doing the right thing. I'm sending my team to training, making sure they go to a 3-day class, check the box, 2-week class, check the box. But then when they come back to the field, is it, A, are we kind of critiquing their performance and giving them feedback, but B, are we even giving them the appropriate feedback? When is the last time, right, our command staff or supervision was trained or knows the right way to do it? And so I think it's challenging, like you said, all from top down and bottom up, is making sure everybody's on the same page in the entire organization.
I think that, while, and, when I do training, I have a process where we train how to practically do it, but we can do one day just on mindset for supervisors.
Yeah.
This is changing your mindset. It's a different approach. And this is about, you talk about restorative justice or other things, but it's really about rethinking the way we're policing. And this is this concept that I call policing with virtue. And we need to get back to being the good guys.
Well, and I think, from the investigators you've worked with and that I've worked with and get to know, is they want to do the right thing, right? Investigators want to help prevent and solve crime. And so what they need is the training and the feedback on how to do it, because sometimes, if you don't get the appropriate feedback, again, you're going to continue to perpetuate bad habits and things that, hey, it's getting me information, I'm going to keep doing it this way. And so the onus of that falls on that accountability piece. What are we doing as supervisors to A, like you said earlier, not measure a successful interview by a confession, and B, give that specific consistent feedback to our teams is really, really important. Yep. And I think all of it's wrapped up with the last principle is, how are we actually implementing this? And what I think is kind of neat is really what the goal of these principles are. We might be talking here on this call at a micro scale of what this actually is. I mean, we're challenging, hey, company X or this agency or this department, take these principles and figure out how you can implement these as a consistent, structural plan for your agency or company. But you're seeing countries, government institutions say these principles are how we're going to adapt to or adhere to. So what does that look like? What's kind of the goal of that from the association?
Yeah, successful, we believe success will breed success. I look for pockets of excellence. One of the things that we've done at Project Lathe is look for pockets of excellence in policing. So we visited Baltimore PD and we looked for pockets of excellence and saw some. Went to Charleston PD and saw pockets of excellence. LaGrange, Georgia, pockets of excellence. So what we're trying to do is, there's a lot of criticism of police. We're actually looking for those things that others will want to emulate, that others want to do. So we look for these pockets of excellence. And so one of the pockets of excellence, I think I mentioned NCS is FLETC. The Federal Law Enforcement Training Center for years was teaching the 5-step approach. They've now abandoned that. They now teach only science-based methods. They've revamped their whole training program. Maria was just down last month, I think September or whatever, again, training their instructors and staff in the SUE technique, the strategic use of evidence. Some incredible work going on in LAPD, robbery, homicide, major crimes division, who've embraced these evidence-based approaches, these science-based methods. The American Bar Association has endorsed the Mendez Principles at their conference just, I think, in August. And so probably my last act as chair of the impact section was having the impact section of the IACP endorse the Mendez Principles. Because what it says is, as you know, that your processes should be based on law, science, and ethics. And if you're in police and you want to argue against those three things, you need to find another profession.
Right. Right. Well, I think that's really neat. The perspective that we get from people in our training is that any of the stuff that we talk about, well, is that going to work for me? Does that work in my agency, in my jurisdiction, in my company? And the answer is yes, right? The way that you and the steering committee have created these principles is you can really use these to formulate your entire plan of how are we going to, first of all, what training organization are we going to even look towards that matches these principles? How are we going to hold our team accountable? How are we going to train our command staff? And I like what you said a few times is how do we change the mindset of anybody that touches this process, which is, I think really, really important. The other just last couple of takeaways here, we've seen, which I'm excited about the last couple of years, things like these principles and from people like you and hopefully from our organization, WZ, and the project of advocating for changes in legislation. So we have seen, I think we're at 5 or 6 states now, and hopefully more to come, that have banned the use of deception in interviews, specifically with juveniles, and more to come. We've seen an increase in legislatively electronic recording being mandated. We just saw some legislation in California last year about removing the use of minimization techniques, suggesting any kind of leniency and deception. And so what we're seeing, I think, from both the science and the law standpoint is it's moving forward. And so for the practitioners that are out there, whether you like it or not, it's time to buy into this process and change the mindset, because it's going to be there one way or another. I want to see any other takeaways you have, and I'm going to put up in the meantime. We've mentioned a few different resources as we've been talking, so I want to make sure everybody has these. So what you've got up there, obviously WZ's website that has a whole bunch of information. I actually wrote an article when you mentioned this earlier today on our call about defining success in an interview. And so we got a bunch of free stuff on our website. I mentioned earlier, Mark is going to be doing a kind of a book club series to discuss his book that's sitting there behind him, Unjustifiable Means, which I highly recommend, through the International Association of Interviewers. And Tony Paishan is going to be working with Mark on that. The project, which Mark, I can let you speak more to that if you'd like, but that's a direct link there that you see up on the screen. I became an affiliate, and I think it's a really good concept and a good way for academics and practitioners to interact. And then the Mendez Principles, which has really been the focus of our conversation, they made it very simple to find. So interviewingprinciples.com, and you can read really the entire kind of packet and see all the incredible members that were a part of developing that. But all resources for everybody that's out there. Also going to make sure this entire video, we're going to save it. We'll upload it to YouTube. So if any of you have peers or leadership that you think would benefit from hearing what Mark had to say today, you can distribute that out. But I want to thank you, Mark, and I know you're kind of retired, but you're a busy guy. You're pulled in all sorts of directions. And I just appreciate not just your time today, but everything you've been doing for the industry, and your perspective and experience has helped me personally kind of mold where my mindset is, and definitely an asset to WZ. So I appreciate all of that and your time today.
Thanks. And David, thanks for being affiliated of Project Lethia. And one last plug for Project Lethia. It's not just by chance that 4 of our advisory council members on Project Lethia were advisory councils on the Mendez Principles. And those Mendez Principles are available in 10 different languages now on that interviewing principle site. And one of the things we did at Project Lethia, because I struggled, like we talked about, Dave, reading the research, we have practitioners writing reflections from the field, talking about their reflections from the field and putting them on there for other practitioners. And we welcome your audience to join Project Lethia and give us your reflections. And we also have state of the science reports. We've asked some of the scientists to distill down into a 1 or 2 page document some of the science, so it's more understandable by practitioners like us, so we can look at what's important and things like that. And so we welcome new affiliates from your audience as well.
Yeah, definitely. We'll make sure that gets out there and people take advantage of it. So the more collaboration we can do, I think the better for everybody. So appreciate your efforts. And Maria, thanks for hanging on and listening to us today as well, and everything you've done for the project. Thanks, Mark. We'll be in touch soon. And thank you all for joining us. The comments that you posted, we appreciate, and we'll make sure we get this out to the masses. Everybody have a good day, have a good holiday, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Dave.